become most visible by the government in order to be able to help us to be able to describe what has occurred with soldiers who've been sent to battle. And as they've come back, rather than describe the process in ways that will be hyper-negative towards the process of sending them there, we can diagnose this and make this clinical and use that to describe their processes. And folks are going through real emotion that we could term as a PTSD. A good friend of mine, Dr. Napoleon Wells, works with the government in a VA hospital and works primarily with people who are victimized by PTSD. And so I talk to him on a regular basis, try to understand what it is that's going on in the psyche of these folks who's undergone these deep oppression, who've been victimized in many interesting ways, seen violence and death for the first time, come back home and can't sleep at night, and have all these things affecting their lives. And he describes it to me beautifully, and he says, listen, when somebody is carted from a place of comfort and put into a place of discomfort, that alone creates a trauma. That gets exacerbated by the fact that you might be able to witness some violence that you've never seen before. That gets exacerbated by the fact that you're around people who see you as an enemy when you position an ideology or a self-perspective of a person that's loving and lovable. And so folks oftentimes who engage or who have been suffered from PTSD, when they become diagnosed, they're approached from a place of absolute love, understanding that in many instances they had no part to play in the trauma that they've been a part of as they engage in this practice of fighting for their nation. Now, PTSD has also been expanded to folks who've had other traumatic experiences, but the primary association of a PTSD is to a person who's gone to war, experienced violence, come back home, and has had these things happen in their lives as a result of that experience. And I make the argument that that PTSD lens must be the lens that we use to look at the young people who are the victims of health inequities and educational inequities, because they're undergoing severe trauma daily. But the language of trauma is not used to describe their experiences, but it's because it's become normalized. The normalizing of their experiences, the describing it as the nature of who they are and how they are. Right? The creation of the person who causes the trauma to exist as the person who's the helper to go in there. So that you cannot see it as trauma. The processes of an institution or a set of institutions that take folks who are not from any place anywhere near the hood and put them in the hood and never undergo the process of understanding the communities where they're going to be working for the very first time. And then the kids come into the school with a certain culture, and then the instructor comes to the school with a different culture, a certain culture, and then they clash in that space, and the kids can't breathe. When we talk about we can't breathe, we talk about we can't breathe in classrooms. Right? And the kids are in there and can't breathe, can't see beyond that norm. And no one can view that experience as trauma on that young person. But rather, they view it as the person who came in there to do the work, as a healer, as a hero, as a person who can leave after 2 years and go become working in D.C. to create more structures that created the issue they were in to begin with. You guys see what I'm saying? Yeah. When Pierre Bourdieu talks about this idea of symbolic violence, it's not a violence of somebody knocking you over the head and beating you up. It's a violence of being in a social space where your culture, yourself, your authentic self cannot merge with the culture of the institution. And every young person who comes from certain communities that goes into classrooms that are created not for them to have voice is undergoing everyday symbolic violence. The symbolic violence over time creates trauma. Trauma over time creates PTSD. That post-traumatic stress that every young person in classrooms is experiencing every day, when it goes undiagnosed, when we fail to use that framework to look at the young people in our classrooms, we fail them. Now, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but I also make the argument that there are a bunch of other PTSDs. There's a post-Trayvon Martin stress disorder in our communities. And our unwillingness to recognize that leads to other issues. When a young person in the classroom, that I have a conversation with, and I said, talk about Trayvon, and he can't speak. And he finally begins to speak. And he starts describing a rap where he can imagine himself on that street in Florida and can see the experience happening. When he can make a vivid connection of placing himself in the context of another person. Because when he saw that image flash across the TV screens consistently, each of those flashing of that image on the TV screen is trauma. Why? Because that person I'm seeing on that screen looks just like me. I wear that hoodie. I love Skittles. I drink Arizonas. So the very seeing of an image that is like you, killed in the street, and allowed to walk free, instantaneously creates a traumatic experience for a young person because they see themselves as having no worth, just like that person had no worth. That is a trauma. Have we addressed the post-Trayvon Martin stress disorder in our communities? And what are the effects of a PTSD? When we talk about folks who are heroes who experience a PTSD, how do we frame that? We talk about the fact that over time other things will happen in their lives. They're more likely to have strokes. They're most likely to engage in violent practices. They're more likely to need intensive preparation for adjustment to real life. And we can frame that idea when we talk about others, but not by our babies, who are undergoing the contemporary versions of that stress. Beyond that, we have to look at the institutions that create that stress. Whenever a stressful situation is created, and this is based on a PTSD experts have talked to me about this in their work in their field, he said the first thing you have to do is you have to work to extract the person from the scenario or the circumstances that are triggers for the enactment of that behavior. You have to take the person out of that place in order to allow them to heal. Well, every day kids are being forced. It's mandatory that you send this kid to that school. They are forced to be there. Now, if in a PTSD traditional case, we know that one of the first things that you are supposed to do to avoid the trauma is to remove the person from the setting that causes the trigger for that trauma. And we acknowledge that and we do that for everybody else. Why don't we do that for our babies? And when we don't do that for our babies, it yields collateral results. I.e., what would happen with somebody who's suffering from traditional PTSD? They are more likely to engage in violent practices. They're more likely to raise their voice in classrooms. They're more likely to be frustrated. But the symptoms that are exhibited from the PTSD becomes a reason for the maintaining of the practices that cause it to happen. Only for them and not for others. Y'all follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
Now let's move this a little further. And we talk about a post-Trayvon Martin or even a post-Tamir Rice stress disorder, which is the most contemporary one, that shooting that happened. But let's talk about a poor teaching stress disorder. I'm for real.
Yeah.
We have been forced to believe that teaching and learning is the penultimate way through which one reaches a certain level of emancipation or upward mobility and success. But that version of teaching and learning includes teaching and learning within very specific institutions with very specific goals. What if I were to tell you, like Neo in the Matrix, what if I were to tell you for 1 second that you don't need traditional teaching and learning to engage in emancipatory practice? I believe you. And I'm a professor in a teaching education institution and a scientist by training, but I'm saying that you have to first be able to extract our young people from the context where they are embedded for them to be able to release their stress. That we have to move them out of the school. Now, that can get you a lot of trouble. When we're going to say en masse, we're taking everybody out of school because the school's not working. But I make the argument that there are alternatives. That we got to put on a new lens, a new hat. And we can argue for the creation of third spaces within traditional classrooms that create alternate realities even within the space that they're embedded. So we gotta look, y'all. You got to look at this thing different. Because if you keep looking at it the way they give it to you, we could talk revolution all day and ain't nothing going to happen. So what does this third space look like? It looks like creating the context within that classroom to allow the kids to be able to transcend the physical space and enter into another space, which is a way of teaching and learning, engaging that those from African roots and traditions engaged in before they went to the traditional school. Anybody ever seen somebody catch the Holy Ghost in church? Yeah. What happens?
They fall out.
They run around. The physical building no longer exists for them in that moment because they're going through a certain form of escapism to help them to be able to deal with the situations that's at present. Y'all feel what I'm saying? So what we need to do in schools, one, I would argue if you could, if a present practice of going in that schools, get the kid out of school. But if the kids aren't going to school, that's why we're doing this. That's why we're doing this program. That's why we're doing this training. That's why we're doing this certificate program. Look, this work is not done. We didn't. Dr. Wallace and I didn't convene and start having conversations about engaging this practice because we felt like it. We're doing this work because it's a necessary work. How do you engage in those emancipatory spaces? Guess what? Guess what? Hip-hop. I said it once, I say it again. Why? Because hip-hop becomes the chief mechanism through which these young people who are engaging in this PTSD find an escape, a temporary one, albeit, from the PTSD. When a young person is sitting in a classroom and writing a verse, or when a rapper is sitting on the stage and imagining himself with 50 Bentleys because he's piss poor, that is their own self-diagnosis and self-medication to be able to escape the PTSD of living within these communities and within these schools. When Pharaoh Mon says, "If you know about struggle, the boy in the plastic bubble. When I drink away the pain, I guzzle. My life is like a complicated mathematical puzzle for real. Seeing death twice as an ugly mother echo, man. But you conversate with him when you suffering." He said, "Let go of the pain, you never rock the mic again. Your choice slept to the brain of 20 Vicodin. I kind of liken it to all the tricycling. Disturbing the natural cycles of life and its trifling. F what you heard, less money, more problems." This is a person in a verse who is describing a stressful situation and using the creation of this verse as a means through which he can escape that reality and deal with that stress. So if folks are doing this and self-diagnosing and doing this on their own, and schools become the main mechanism of oppression, then what we're asking you to support us in doing is bringing this mechanism that they've been doing in the self-diagnosis on their own, unstructured, unbridled, into the school to create these third spaces where they can have some release. Listen, when a community only gets release or treatment from their PTSD by living a fantasy that's on television, we know that not only are the young people victims of a PTSD, but we all collectively are. When Shonda Rhimes writes an issue of a television show of Scandal and mimics what happens with that young man or young men who've been killed at the hands of police and reconstructs what happened, right? Reconstructs a scenario of a young man being shot in the street, his father being upset, then creates a fantasy of the father having the agency enough to be able to fight for his son. Then constructs a fantasy of the Department of Justice caring enough to be able to make a statement. And constructs a fantasy of the president having the ability to be able to speak to the issue that just happened. And constructs a fantasy of that man being able, not villainized by the media, but being seen as a whole person. And having the ability to heal and cry. When a television show is the only mechanism through which we can have freedom and release from the stress of our existence, something is terribly wrong. And that's not a contemporary issue. That's been happening for a very long time. When we got the Cosby Show to be an image of the perfect family in the midst of Reaganomics and crack in Brooklyn. And watching the show becomes the only release. We're in a sick place. And the reason why we're in a sick place is because what we've become doing is we end up in a process where we are given the weapons of mass distraction. Right? I can live my fantasy of freedom out through a television show. Therefore, I don't have to go into the real life and real work and do the work for freedom, for healing.
We with you.
Look, this work of looking at the trauma that we've all underwent and we all still undergo is not only necessary work for us to identify in the communities that we want to heal, but it's necessary work for each and every one of us to do. As we sit in this space as scholars and academics and aspiring academics, we oftentimes are the weakest ones. Why do I say that? Because the strongest ones are sometimes ones who refuse to be able to become acclimated into the structure and say no. We who think we are the heroes are oftentimes the ones who were easily broken and bent enough to believe the narrative that going through these structures and these